Okay, so this study is the personal discovery review on the session one, A New Life.
Yep.
And the first question is, what happened when you asked Jesus Christ to be your Lord? So in this question, and there's some clues and cues on the page, Bobby, in the sense that when you look up the top, there's a heading, a legal transaction, and there's a little guy, a little cartoon character there with a guy standing in a deed.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
what
So,
we're
right, obviously and this is where we got because I'm looking and learning it from the coaches as well. After I did this myself, I went back to the coach's manual and I saw that you got a legal transaction took place. Now,
yeah.
obviously, if you just take the language as it is in English, it's very easy for that not to come across. So, one of my questions was, as I was reading this, okay, which of the words have that legal connotation when you go back to Strong's or whatever? Yeah. Um,
Okay. So
does
it's
that make
probably
sense?
coming, yeah, yeah, it is. But it's probably coming back to where we were in the sense, like we use that Bible verse there, if anyone old come into him and dine with him. And it
Yeah.
ties in with what we had, in the study, is that we want to convey to people when they ask Jesus into their life, they're transferred out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. That's what we're trying to convey here so that they don't. And it'll make more sense when we do the next study, the kingdom of darkness, because which we'll get into shortly, is that we want to show them that by the confession of their mouth, they've transferred from one kingdom to the other. That's what we're trying to say.
Oh no, no. So look, I get that and I understand that. I suppose for me, I was just wondering: is there something in this verse when you? Because I know a lot of when you delve into the Greek or the Hebrew at the core roots of some of the
Yeah.
Bible, you you actually get a shift. Because let's be honest, English can be a rubbish language sometimes, right? And we miss so much. And it's why I've got a whole host of different translations of the Bible that I go to because different translators pick up on different aspects of the Greek or the Hebrew and the way they translate it. And so to get the full richness of the Bible, you've almost got to go to multiple translations, right?
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, is there something in that verse that specifically points to the legal transaction? Because whilst I understand holistically that that's happened, I was just wondering in regard to this verse, because obviously the context of the question said, read this verse and see what it says. And I was just wondering,
Mm.
is there something I'm missing in this verse in particular? But no, okay. So you're taking it from a more holistic aspect of this is what's taking place when we go through this, not just specifically from this verse.
Yeah,
Um,
and then also understand which I realize you probably haven't watched it, is if you've watched the video behind the scenes, we're using the imagery in that, which it comes back to good things or bad things are happening on earth. Why is this
yeah,
happening behind the scenes? Then it explains, which we use in the Christian kingdom, there's a gap. God's on one side, we're on the other side, we're separated by the sin.
yeah,
So the new Christian, part of the training is they've actually watched that video so they can
yeah.
see when they
Okay,
ask Jesus into their life, they're transferred from one kingdom to the other. Now, you got to
yeah, okay,
appreciate when we wrote this, we began this in 2002. So we would have done, and I worked with very gifted theologians. So we would have chosen the verses with it. And I think this
yeah,
verse is the closest that we had to it. And when you look at, I will come into him and dine with him, that is where I'd have to go back and have a look at the Greek on that. But, but that's what we're trying to say. If you look at it, I stand in the door and knock, and if anyone opens the door, I will come into him. So when you look
yeah,
at those verses, that's what's happening. But it's tied in with what we said. And you're right
yeah,
about the holistic part as well. It's tied in with that, with what we showed that video. We want them to
yeah,
show them because most new Christians don't understand. This is the challenge. They don't understand the two spiritual kingdoms, and they don't understand the fact that when you ask Jesus into your life, you're no longer under the headship of Satan. You're now under the headship of Jesus. That's what
Yeah.
we're trying to convey to them in this message, right?
Yep.
And it's right in that sense. This is a question in this one. This is the question that most people do miss. And that's why a lot of the times we've used imageries like up the top as the clue, a legal transaction. In the spiritual sense, a legal transaction has taken place. That's what we're trying to get
Yep.
across there. So your next question is discuss what you discovered as you filled in the kingdom dynamics for John chapter 3 verses 1 to 5, which is page 27 in your
Yep.
book.
Yep. Yeah, so going through a new order of life, Jesus used the figure of new birth to dramatically indicate things. We see the kingdom of God. Through new birth, we are introduced literally to enter into a new realm. And the whole being to the supernatural dimension, fitting us for the beginning in God's kingdom order. It's interesting because obviously being involved in kingdom initiatives and a number of other things, I always talk about, and I know we're going to be looking at the start of the kingdom of darkness soon, but I always look at it and talk in terms of there's the kingdom and there's the counterfeit. You know, because everything about the other kingdom that we're kind of that, or I don't like to give him the credit of calling him a king. So I just call it the counterfeit, because it's been interesting looking at, when you look at financial systems, when you look at agricultural systems, when you look at all these things, we can see, and I've got great examples from people I've met who work in these different spaces. The stuff that is aligned to God's kingdom principles and his way of operating in all these spheres. And then you've got the ways that the world has tried to embed the counterfeit. I mean, we talk about things like the lottery, for example. The lottery is a counterfeit for God's blessing.
Yep.
Right? And there's all these people that are desperately seeking the lottery, right? So they're trying and trying. But then you look at what actually happens when people get blessed by the lottery, and most of them have their lives completely destroyed and end up worse off than they ever were. There's very few actually come through that and end up better off. So it's interesting when we look at these counterfeits, how they're always destructive in the long term, and they always create bondage, or, you know, it's really, really interesting when we look at those biblical concepts of the two together, and people go, they just don't get it.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yep. Yes, that's exactly right. Yep. And you're right. We'll be talking about the kingdom of darkness, which is our next topic in our next session.
Yeah.
So then question 3 is, what did it tell you about new birth, which is the same question there on the same page? What did it tell you about new
that
birth?
through being born again into a new awakening, we have access to new things which weren't possible for us before.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then question 4 is discuss how to look up truth in action, because this also is helping people learn.
Yeah. I gathered
find,
that's what you were doing. You were helping them to navigate in and out of the Bible. Yeah. So understanding, perceiving the kingdom of God, entering it were impossible without spiritual rebirth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then question 6, question 5, discuss what right receiving Jesus into your life gave you as God's children. That's page 29.
Yeah, okay. The right to become a child of God.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then there on question 6, discuss the footnotes, their value, and how to use them. So how did you find those? And now you've used this Bible beforehand, so it's a bit of a
I've got the first edition.
yeah.
Where are you? So we go, that's D, God's child. You're across into the truth and action one, are you?
Yeah, so this is just question 6 is the footnotes, their value and how to use them. Did you so what it is what value have you found in using the footnotes? That's really what it's just like an observation now.
Yeah, I'm just Where was that quiz?
It's the question. It's let me just see. Question 6 in your book, which is the questions on page 41 in your book. And the question says, discuss footnotes, their value,
Oh,
and how to use. So that's what we're wanting to do is the value of the footnotes. And
yes, yes. Sorry, yes, got you. Yes, yeah. No, I find for me they're a bit like Wikipedia.
yeah,
I go into Wikipedia and I can start thinking I'm looking at something else, and then you end up going around this trail. And when you, especially when you link them with kind of, the cross. I know it talks about those in A, but when you start looking at the Bible links and the cross references, you can end up reading one thing and end up bouncing between 3 or 4 different passages and concepts all over the place, which is fantastic. But yeah, I end up somewhere very different to where I think I was going when I started, if that makes sense to because you
uh,
start reading. So yeah, I find they're brilliant. I can get lost just reading through all the bits and pieces and then chasing the rabbit warren of different links and bits and pieces.
yeah.
And yeah, time disappears very quickly when I can get into that space, I must admit.
Yeah, but you must admit though, it's good time that gets disappears though, isn't it? Because it's
Oh,
like it's fantastic.
absolutely. Because you're learning and you're beginning to see links between things that you maybe haven't seen before. And I suppose that for me was one of the things that began to draw me back. So are you familiar with a software called eSword?
Yeah, I do. I use it all the time. I
Yeah,
love it.
yeah. So I've got eSword, and obviously that allows me to jump into Strongs, and
Yeah,
it's been a great thing for me to not just to study um not just to study the Bible and what it says, but also, I mean, there's the Upside Down Kingdom by Craybill, which is really good because it starts to talk about what was the society in which this was written. I've even got a really good book that talks about the fact that Matthew originally wasn't a Greek book, it was a Hebrew book. And when you begin to understand Matthew in the context of it originally being written in Hebrew and not Greek, it shifts your mindset about how they translate certain passages because there's a
yeah,
lot of word patterns within Matthew that don't make sense in Greek. But when you understand them as Hebrew phrases, they immediately translate a little bit differently. And so Matthew's my favorite gospel. And so it's through things like that delving that you go, right, okay, I want to understand not just what it says to me today, but what they were trying to say and when they were writing it, what was their context of writing it back then. And I find things like the footnotes and beginning to link these things really help to draw out that picture. In fact, that was
yeah.
one of the things. That original verse we looked at, that was one of the things that I was thinking. Is there something in the Hebrew system about when you invite somebody in to eat with you that talks about different roles or different acts of establishing agreements?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point, isn't it? Because one of the books that I read is Edsel Vosso's book, The Ecclesia, and
Yes.
it just to you probably got it on the shelf as well, but
Well,
it's
I'm
like
actually studying.
under
I'm studying in depth that I'm doing what's called the Ecclesia Accelerator with Ed Silvoso. So he takes
oh
us through that book, but he also links that book back to virtually every other book that he wrote and shows why they're all connected and talks about Ecclesia effectively being the natural evolution of all of those other books and what he's taught.
okay.
Because
I,
establishing
I
Ecclesia is one of the big things that I'm looking to do in Brisbane.
Yes, and I think that's where the whole kingdom, church kingdom, has to transition to really understand that
Yes.
whole ecclesia concept. I mean, it just that book, The Ecclesia, was just another piece of the puzzle, but it was just life changing for me because I've been walking around probably the last 4 or 5 years going, like it just dropped into my spirit. Well, you know what? We're the government. We're the government of God. We're the government. And all people are looking at me like, like a rabbit in the spotlight. Like what are you talking about? And so
Yeah.
for me, that really, really helped it. But coming back to what you said about the Bible, and this Bible with the footnotes,
Yeah.
I really struggled from a non-Christian point of view. Man, it was so hard for me to be able to understand the Bible. And my wife, I don't even know where or how she bought it, but she bought that first edition. And by that stage, I'd migrated through to the Amplified Bible. So I was reading that. And then one day
Okay.
I
Yeah.
picked up her Bible by accident. And I started to navigate these things around with footnotes and truth in action and kingdom dynamics and the word well. And I like you, I was lost for hours. I went, wow, how good is this? Because it just all of a sudden you've got all these gifted Bible scholars putting all their commentaries and other things, and then also your mini strong concordance in the back and your understanding
Yep.
of the different words. It's just a fantastic Bible, and that's why we built the course around that Bible, because of all these extra notes, and just assembled in a way to make it easy for people to understand. All right, so next question is 7. What
Yep.
did you discover? What you discovered about your new authority as God's child from the word wealth on Mark chapter 3, verse 15, page 32 in your book.
So again, this again, it goes back to, and I suppose we were just talking about this whole thing about the language and understanding the underlying language. The understanding of how the different, as I say, English being such a poor language, we use a word and nobody really understands the depth of it. But when you get into the depths of the words that were originally used, going back to Strong's and things like that, just getting a real depth of understanding of what authority really is. And I was on, in fact, I've heard it come up in a couple of courses, and I've since found out that these people were actually Christians. They weren't teaching Christian things, but there's book writing courses and all this. And I don't know if you're familiar with some of these that are going around, but they all talk about, if you want to have authority in society, write a book about the topic that you want to claim to have authority on, right? And you go back to real biblical authority. And as you pointed out right at the get-go, God authored the book. Well, he didn't just author the book, he authored the universe. You know what I mean? He was the creator. So when we start then talking about the transfer of authority, we're getting authority transferred to us from the person who has ultimate authority over everything. And when you begin to get that depth through looking at some of these other words and other bits and pieces, it shifts your mindset about what you can do.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly right. And that's what's one of the things that's missing in our current church kingdom, is people don't understand their authority. And I think that got robbed from them. And when back in 300 AD, when Constantine became a follower of Jesus, and he converted all these temples into church buildings, and that's what we now have got. But prior to that, if you look at it, there was a very different, Christian community to the one that we currently see.
Yeah.
All right, so then we also covered it, which we just basically just covered. We just jumped back a page there with the Bible links and cross references, but we've already covered that in our conversation there by default. It's just they just open it up, open up a whole new world. So question 9, whose child are we? What name can we call God?
Yeah, I always love that, especially when you understand it was quite confusing when I first, obviously having grown up listening to ABBA music, you go, right, okay. No, actually, that's not what but yeah, that whole aspect of understanding that ABBA is almost a really close, intimate nickname within their culture and their structure that is effectively like calling out daddy, because we talk about God the Father, and the Father in our language is a very formal, kind of very respectful reference for male parent, right? But when you come to this, where it talks about Abba, it's much more like crying out daddy. And it's a much more intimate, and yeah, that different shift in the mental state where you've got a different level of depth that you can talk to him, not as some authoritative kind of. I always try to see the analogy of you see the old English movies where the father would come in and he'd be in his room and the children would come in and have to be all prim and proper and then they'd walk back out. And whilst there's an element, I think, that the church has lost that level of respect, which is why I like going to some of the more traditional churches, because their level of respect and reverence of God is much higher. The truth is, we also have a father we can just run and he'll come and play ball with us. You know, that different analogy of a different model of father. So, I hope that kind of answers the question that you were asking.
Yeah, it's good. The audience that'll listen to these will love it. All right, so question 10, what did you discover in the kingdom dynamics on Colossians 1:13 about living in a new kingdom? That's page 36 in your book.
Yep. Well, as I said, look, I mean, for me, there's this whole shift where we begin to see all this. I mean, you look at, I'm a systems thinker, right? So for me, it's about understanding there's a whole different set of systems that operate in the way the world has never taught you to operate, that are absolutely fundamentally relevant to the way that God wants us to operate. And that for me was, I suppose, the key to the kingdom, the shift in the kingdom.
Yep. And then question 11, what are the 4 types of ground Jesus mentions in his parable? That's page 40.
Yeah, so we're going back. So this was the first. I go to Luke typically when I read this parable, but this was the first parable that God really spoke to me really strongly through when I first became a Christian, because I grew up in a house called Wayside.
Okay.
So, and the name of the house that my parents still live in to this day is called Wayside. And it's really, really interesting because my father will still now attend church. My mother was the very first convert I ever had to the kingdom after I became a Christian. She started going back to church and she's been heavily actively involved in church since the day I told her I became a Christian. In fact, I was lucky enough to baptize her a few years ago, which was brilliant. It was, but yeah, the whole aspect of really understanding different things, and obviously that put a whole different spin on it for me when it's got that kind of that connotation, because names are really, really important. Yeah, they're important to God. They're important to us. The aspect of the different types of ground, and then the relationship to different types of people's hearts is really interesting, in that we took this whole parable so much to heart based on the fact I grew up in Wayside, that we called our first house Comashke, which is Greek for the good ground. And so our first house we called the good ground, and it was a place where we brought the boys into our house. That it was a place where we ran ministry groups, we did all that kind of stuff. In fact, we've only just sold it a few weeks ago. And the whole way around, the way that we rented it when we moved out of it was all about, this isn't about making lots of money, this is about the opportunity to bless. And as it turned out, many of the families that ended up living there were Christians, and those that weren't seemed to go through really bizarre instances and then try and get out of the house and almost run away from it. So I take this parable, and in particular the different types of ground that it talks about, in a much deeper sense, I suppose, than a lot of people, because it was my felt experience. Whilst I was in Scotland, the house I grew up in was a big granite house. I never knew God almost the entire time that I lived there. It wasn't until I moved out of there and came to Australia that I first encountered God. And yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but that's certainly where my headspace is always at. But it was Luke I first read this parable in, and so it tends to be Luke I go back to. But yeah.
So then, and you're obviously on your answer there for the sake of our audience that'll listen to this. What are the four types of ground that Jesus mentions in the parable?
Yeah, so you've got the hard ground, the wayside where the word is sown, right? That's the stony ground where it's you've got the good ground, and what's the other one that they just the name of it?
You've been saying it, wayside.
Yeah, the wayside, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
wayside,
so
yeah, wayside, stony ground, thorns, and good ground.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
the question is an obvious one. It's a no-brainer for you. Which one? What sort of ground would you like your life to become? Well, I think we know the answer to that. Basically, already said it.
yeah, absolutely. But it also is I find this parable really interesting because there's also we talked about the 3DM stuff. And in the 3DM
Yep.
stuff, they talk about looking for people of peace.
Yep.
Because I think one of the other things that we do and we take on ourselves is that we've got to go out there and every person we meet, we've got to turn them into a Christian. And a long time ago, this verse God used to help me understand that actually my job is not to turn every person into a Christian. My job is to help make the ground suitable and just sow the seeds that God gives me, because God is taking them on a journey that I will not always see the end of, or I don't know
Yep.
where on that journey they are. So they talk about in the discipleship stuff, look for people of peace, for people whose God's hearts has already transformed.
Yep.
And that's great if you're just looking for people to convert, but we're looking to have an impact on all people.
Yep.
And effectively, we want to turn people that are currently stony ground into an environment where that ground is more receptive as well.
Yep.
So, this to me is why when we talk kingdom, kingdom isn't just about me and my personal, it's about helping become an aspect of the kingdom in this world so that we transform. We talk about sheep nations or all these other terms that are going around. I want to, for me, creating those things is about taking people from being that wayside, the stony ground, and these types of ground into making them more fertile places where the seed of God could be planted.
Yeah. Absolutely. 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 Well said. And one of the reasons for this question that's in there for a brand new believer, we
Mm.
want to set them up right for a start to show them which soil do they want. So by verbally articulating, we want to be in say making the statement good ground, that we can remind them later on if they're falling backwards or whatever. Hang on a second, you talked about you wanted to be good ground. So that was what one of the reasons why we put it. But I love your answers there of what you said. So that concludes the personal discovery review, and our next topic will
Yep.
be Kingdom of Darkness, the presentation for
Yep.
that.